What you do in October, November, and I suppose late September for the heavier soils, what you do on the farm at that stage is the biggest influence on grass supply in the spring. The next biggest influence then is the weather. The weather is, you can't predict that, but we have a reasonable idea what will grow over the winter and what will happen into January and February.
Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef Podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan, and on this week's episode, as the grazing of the last rotation approaches, I'm joined by the Grass 10 team, John Maher, Joseph Dunphy and John Douglas. You're all very welcome. Before we start, perhaps you'll give a review of the year to date across the country. Joseph, in the West, what have you seen?
It's been quite a topsy-turvy sort of year. When we look at some of the averages, Catherine, in terms of grass growing, we're kind of going to be happy where we are in terms of the tonnage, but that has been very much up and down in terms of depending on the time of the year in terms of growth, but also in terms of weather conditions. If we look at the dry stock farms from pasture basin and the overall figures, we're looking at about 7.5 ton grown, which if we go back to maybe 2021, where we grow about 10.1 ton on average for the year, we're largely roughly where we're supposed to be at 7.5 ton grown year to date. Last year in 2022, we kind of had the drought at this time. So when we only ended up with about 9.2 ton grown. So in general, it's been a good grass growing year. If we look back, I suppose, look in my area, Catherine, if we take just two weather stations, for example, Athenry and Claremorris, Athenry has got up to the 1st of September had about 940 mil of rain. And on a typical long-term average of about, from the long-term average about 1178 for the year. So it had a huge amount of rain got up to the 1st of September this year, whereas last year it only got 600 mil of rain up to the 1st of September. So there's a huge amount of rainfall there, as we've seen from or heard in previous podcasts, there for July, probably between 3 and 4 times in certain regions. Similar enough in Claremorris there as well, long-term averages of 1,200 mil of rain, and year to date it's got in around 800. So again, a very wet summer, and in particular on farms with heavier stock. So if we have if it's sucklers or maybe heavy cattle, and particular farms with heavier soils, there during July, Catherine, a lot of rainfall, constant days with rain days, maybe 13 or 14 days for the month with rainfall in, and that really just capped it off. And a lot of heavier cattle around that time were housed. But things have improved on those farms. The last couple of weeks, Catherine, a lot of good weather, which has allowed maybe bits of third cut silage to be taken. It has allowed an opportunity for to get good graze outs on high covers.
That's great, Joseph. And John Maher, in the south of the country, has there been much difference, similar rainfall possibly?
Sure, similar trends to what Joe outlined, Catherine. Roller coaster of a year: dry February, very wet March; dry June, very wet July; fabulous weather of late; great grass growth of late. It won't be a record year for grass growth, but it won't be bad at this point in time, which is September. I would say grass quality in June and July now were a challenge for most parts of the country, I would say, because of the way the weather came. The inconsistent patterns, from wet to dry. I suppose one figure will stand out for me, all right, Catherine, for Kerry. They've taken the brunt of the rainfall now, to be honest, I would say. And I know in 1 week in July, they got 10% of their rainfall. They got almost 7 inches, 6.5 inches in the space of 7 days. So that's horrendous. They've had a few other belts of intense rainfall over short periods, which has created challenges. However, a bit like Joe saying, the last while has got dry, have given great opportunity to get, silage made, albeit delayed. Mightn't be the best quality, but the quantity is there. So, I suppose not too bad in the overall scheme of things. And I suppose as we look forward now, Catherine, because grass growth has picked up, there's a good supply of grass and farm. All the figures will show that from pasture base, and given the price of silage and more importantly the price of meal, it's a great opportunity to take advantage of grass going into the autumn now, given the costs of the alternatives.
Most definitely. John Maher mentioned there a roller coaster year so far. John Douglas, has it been as challenging in the east?
Yeah, Catherine. I suppose if you wanted to summarise a great start, in on any of the farmers that managed to get out in February, they got a great start to the year. But for those, I suppose it just shows the flexibility. If you're not flexible, you can miss these opportunities. And for those that maybe weren't as flexible for whatever reason, they came, the maybe the traditional time of March when you're letting stock out was very wet, and April was challenging as well, and it was really into the second week of May before things really started to dry out in a lot of places. But I suppose in the east, then I suppose they're probably better able to cope with that, as in general they get lower rainfall, and but I suppose May got very dry. There was feeding out of probably silage and stuff in June or late May, definitely into June, on some farms to handle that slowdown in grass growth. But once it picked up, look, a lot of farmers, I suppose, maybe around the east would tell you a wet summer suits them. So they actually didn't grow any record amounts, as John said, but grew consistently through kind of when it started raining through into August, and the last few weeks have been very good. Um, One thing I would note is this time of year, like where I'd say a lot of farms are on target with building up grass compared to other years, which is great because, as John said, it gives that opportunity now to utilize more grass into the autumn, which avoids feeding silage and meal so much, which is better for profitability.
You mentioned they were now into mid-September. What's the plan and the targets now for the autumn rotation, John Douglas?
So we're into the build-up. Farmers should be building up over the last couple of weeks. I suppose most beef farms probably lower stock, so coming into the end of August, early September, should be building up grass. The target is now to be grazing covers towards the end of September, early October, that are probably up on 1,800, 2,000 kilos of dry matter. For anyone not familiar with that, that's probably between 3 and 4 fists of grass. That's the heaviest covers we should be grazing, and that'll extend out the rotation length. So rotation length should be going from 30, 35 days out towards 40 to 50 days by early October before we start closing up the farm.
And Joseph, I suppose in the west of Ireland, a lot of suckler farms, particularly with weaning taking place this time of year, what are kind of the targets that those farmers should be targeting?
On those farms with suckler cows, and a bit of weaning going on, the stocking rate might be that little bit lower. So again, there's probably a decision to be made on the farm if covers are gone maybe too high. If pre-grazing yields are, maybe above 2,300 at the minute, this is probably really the last week that farmers have in terms of maybe baling a paddock. Okay, the priority, to try and get some of those fields grazed off when there is very if the covers are over 2,300 can be quite challenging, especially if the weather gets poor. And Catherine, some people will maybe bring in stock for a few days to around that at weaning time, which will lower the stocking rate. So just try and make a decision. If covers are gone too high, take out a paddock or two at the minute if it's gone over the top.
Really and truly closing up correctly sets up the farm for the spring. What do you say to farmers that may be tempted to go back in and graze paddocks that have been closed now in October, John Maher?
Okay, well, the most important thing, I suppose, Catherine, is to kind of have a plan for the last closing of the farm. What you do in October, November, and I suppose late September for the heavier soils, what you do on the farm at that stage is the biggest influence on grass supply in the spring. The next biggest influence then is the weather. The weather's you can't predict that, but we have a reasonable idea what will grow over the winter and what will happen into January and February. However, if farmers get overly greedy with grass and stay grazing late, you run down the cover on the farm. When you run down the cover on the farm, it doesn't have the leaf to trap the light, albeit limited light, to get growth. So you end up then with a lower supply of grass in early February or early March, and you grow less. So there's a balance here. You bring too much and you get losses of decay or the grass rotting. You bring too little and you don't grow as well next spring, and you also affect the quantity of grass supply available to the animals next spring. So it's about having a plan. And broadly, that starts for most farms somewhere in the first half of October. You close away through the farm and you finish off whenever late October, early November. You schedule the withdrawal of animals off the farm depending on your system. I think the lighter animals should probably stay out last, and the heavier animals come in first because they tend to do more damage. The real backward weanlings should be housed first of the weanlings, and they should be the first to go out in the spring. Often people do vice versa on that. So the weakest weanlings should be housed first of the weanling grouping, and the most forward weanlings housed last, just to give the weaker weanlings a chance to adjust. But I suppose in a nutshell, Catherine, you start closing on the heavier farms the end of September. The normal farms are around early to mid-October, close on rotation. And that when you come to the point we'll say, I'll just make it an educated guess here, Catherine, early November, there needs to be the fields that have 600 or 700 or 800 kilos on them at that stage, right? You need to stop grazing then, because now you're starting to eat into the next year's grass supply. And as a quick number, about 2/3 of the grass that you have available next spring comes from what you do in the autumn. So it's a case of having, a reasonable supply of grass without overdoing it. But generally, if you follow a rotational plan, or a plan that starts, I'd say the 10th of October and finishes in early November, and you close the farm up on that type of schedule, Catherine, you won't be too far off the mark now, right? The big risk is that you keep grazing and shave out the farm completely. Then you will not have grass available next spring. Then you will not grow grass well next spring.
Most definitely, and that tends to be an issue on some farms in the spring.
It does.
Given the amount of white clover that has been incorporated into swards and the number of walks and open days that you've held in relation to white clover, how should these paddocks be managed differently in the last rotation, John Douglas?
So in the last rotation, I suppose we can look at, I suppose, this year, right now, Catherine, in terms of some of the reseeded grass swards from this year. They should probably, be grazed, continue to graze them at kind of the normal covers of that 1,300 to 1,400 kilos of dry matter, or whatever, that 9 centimeters of grass, or 2 to 3 fists, whichever way you want to quantify that. We don't want to build up heavy covers on them, because we need light down to the base, even through the autumn time. And that gives the clover the best chance to establish. Then as we move into our closing rotation, we don't want these paddocks to close up first. So depending on when you kind of start closing and finish closing, you're aiming to close the clover paddocks towards the end of October, early November. And I suppose if you can leave it to November, all the better. And what that does is you graze it down to 4 centimeters, you let light down to the base, and then over the winter time, even the small bit of limited light that John talked about is getting down there. And in the springtime, you're giving that clover the best chance to survive the winter. Carrying a big, heavier cover, so closing it up early, allows the grass to shade out the clover plants, and basically less of them survive then through the winter because of that.
That's great, John. I suppose we've seen a lot of swards being put in the past number of years in relation to multi-species. Joseph, have you any key tips for farmers that are closing up paddocks with multi-species swards?
Yeah, so again, Catherine, on the multi-species, and especially maybe for some of this year's lays, it's going to be important. We're after having good weather, so some of this year's multi-species, they're growing away very, very strongly at the minute. The couple of key pointers of that is to keep an eye on the weed burden, because as we know, those paddocks, Catherine, can't get a post-emergent spray, so the spot spraying needs to be kept on top of all the time. And so be after each graze, and just be aware of what maybe docks, or maybe a bit of red shank or something like that are in that lay, and to hit them then with the your knapsack, or your sprayer on the back of the quad, and keep on top of them. And again, Catherine, especially just to try and keep the covers fairly low in the multi-species swards for the winter. So again, very similar to what John has just covered there. Try and keep the pre-grazing yields down as you move through September, and then try and graze off towards the end of your last rotation there at the end of October and early November.
In relation to red clover that has been grown on farms, Joseph, what key tips have you for farmers to avoid heavy covers over the winter?
Yeah, so yes, Catherine. Yeah, so it's been a super opportunity on the red clover, and again with the good weather there in early September, a lot of maybe either third or fourth cuts have been taken on red clover silage. I suppose the key point with red clover is it's not as prone to shading. And I suppose than white clover is. So, but it is still good practice to clear off any red clover herbage by grazing there the second half of again in late October or early November. Because there can be some dieback and rot away of the red clover over the winter times. So again, very similar to what we're talking about is try and clean off that herbage in late October or early November.
It's an ideal time really for farmers to be applying lime, particularly for farmers that might have applied for the liming scheme. What advice have you for applying lime, John Douglas?
Yeah, absolutely super time because as you said, the weather conditions have been very good over the last couple of weeks, and there's also a lot of silage being cut, whether it's late or third cut. So there's a lot of open, bare ground, we'll say, and especially this time of year as well, our rotation lengths are longer. So animals that are grazing the field this week, they won't be coming back to it for about a month or so. So you've perfect opportunity, ground conditions. So I definitely would be ordering lime. I'd look at my soil test results and see what they say in terms of how much I need to apply. But I'd be definitely for anything that's below 6 or maybe even around 6. Probably requires about 2 ton of lime per acre to get it back up to the optimum. We're aiming for a pH of 6.3 for grasslands and even up to 6.5 for grass clover swards. So we are actually even increasing that pH a little bit to facilitate the clover establishment on farms. And so yeah, about 2 tons of lime per acre. If it's maybe 6.1, 6.2, you might do 1 ton of lime per acre. But the important thing is, I suppose, to do your soil tests and, look at your soil tests. If you don't have in-date soil tests as well, that's important to plan to get done this autumn or over this winter to get your soil test up to date.
And what are the key points really for farmers that haven't soil samples that you mentioned but are interested in getting soil samples taken now?
I suppose if there has been like some slurry or P and K fertilizer put out lately, we tend to say leave it 2 to 3 months. So that's why generally the soil sampling is kind of a late autumn over winter time, because farms may have applied some nutrients to the ground that could, I suppose, give you some inaccurate results, because it would be picking up some of the P and K that you would have put out rather than what's actually in the soil. So we want to give that break and then go and get the farm sampled. So look, I suppose you can get it done through Teagasc or you can get it done yourself privately, but you want to get a good accurate picture of the farm. So you're walking your paddocks in kind of a W shape, collecting up enough core samples that you can then combine to give an accurate analysis of your soil, which you can send off and get the results back. And make sure to talk to your advisor about what fertilizer should I be spreading in for next year, what should I be ordering to either increase your soil fertility, to maintain it, to basically get the best out of it for your farming system.
That's great, John. Thanks very much. I suppose you've covered a lot of detail there in relation to different swards and closing up for the last rotation. To wrap up, have each of you one tip for farmers to consider for the next 6 weeks? Joseph, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so Catherine, the top tip from me, I suppose, pre-grazing yields at the minute are somewhere in around 1,900 or 2,000 on beef farms, which again, maybe on the higher stocking rate farms is okay. Because there's maybe a lot of mouths to get through it. For maybe the lower stocked farmers, it's important to make that decision. Do I need to take any more silage out, or am I going to be able to get through it? If I'm able to get through it, it's important to try and get through those heavy covers of 22, 2300 in the right weather conditions. So try and take them out this little bit earlier in September. Use your strip wire with 12-hour or 24-hour allocations and a back fence then to protect regrowths.
Yeah, so I suppose my tips is to have a plan in place for this autumn, in terms of closing up the farm in rotation, so that therefore you have a range of covers and a range of covers that you can go to in the springtime. Make sure the paddocks that are closest to the yard, the driest paddocks, the most sheltered, the easiest ones to get to, make sure they're closed up kind of in late October, so that they have the right amount of grass on them when it comes to the springtime and when you want to get stock out to graze.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Catherine, and thanks to all your listeners, and we hope to see you all next week at the Teagasc stand at the National Ploughing Championships.
For further updates from the Grass Tin team, check out the weekly newsletter on the Teagasc website. The link is available in the podcast text. That's all for this week's episode, and my thanks to the Grass Tin team for joining me on the show. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan, and thanks for listening.